April 25, 1980, a remote salt flat in the Iranian desert, 200 miles from Tehran. What was supposed to be America's boldest rescue mission in history was now an inferno. 8 helicopters, 6 C-130 transport planes, 132 of America's most elite warriors. One mission: bring home 53 Americans held hostage by revolutionary Iran. But in the span of 3 hours, everything that could go wrong did. Mechanical failures, sandstorms, collisions, fire, death. This is the story of Operation Eagle Claw, the mission that was minutes away from success, but instead became one of the greatest military disasters in American history. A disaster so devastating, it would topple a presidency and force the United States to completely rebuild how it conducts special operations. This is the night that changed everything. To understand this catastrophe, we have to go back 6 months earlier. November 4th, 1979, the American Embassy in Tehran, Iran. 3,000 militant Iranian students scaled the walls, overwhelmed the guards, and took 66 Americans hostage. 3 more diplomats were seized at the Iranian Foreign Ministry. This wasn't just an attack, it was revenge. 2 weeks earlier, President Jimmy Carter had allowed Iran's deposed leader, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, into the United States for cancer treatment. To Iran's new revolutionary leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, this was the ultimate betrayal. The students had one demand: return the Shah to face trial in Iran. Until then, the hostages would remain captive. 13 hostages, women and African Americans, were released by mid-November as a humanitarian gesture. But 53 remained. And as diplomatic negotiations collapsed week after week, the American public grew furious. The plan they devised was audacious. Some would say insane. Codename Operation Eagle Claw. It would involve elements from all 4 branches of the military: Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. Over 130 men, dozens of aircraft. A 2-day operation deep inside hostiles' territory. And it would mark the combat debut of America's newest elite unit, Delta Force. Here's how it was supposed to work. 8 Navy RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters would launch from the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz in the Arabian Sea. They'd fly 600 miles across the Gulf of Oman over Iranian airspace, navigating at 200 feet to avoid radar detection. The helicopters would rendezvous with 6 Air Force C-130 transport planes at a remote salt flat deep in the Iranian desert, codenamed Desert 1. There they'd refuel and pick up the assault teams: Delta Force operators, Army Rangers, and Air Force combat controllers. Under cover of darkness, the helicopters would transport the operators to a mountain hideout 50 miles outside Tehran, Desert 2. They'd hide there through the day. The following night, Delta Force would be driven into Tehran by CIA operatives already on the ground. They'd storm the embassy compound, neutralize the guards, rescue the 53 hostages, and load them into the helicopters. While Delta evacuated the hostages from the embassy, Army Rangers would simultaneously seize a nearby airfield. C-141 Starlifter cargo planes would land, pick up everyone: hostages, Delta, Rangers, and fly them to safety. It was complex. It was dangerous. It required perfect timing, flawless execution, and more than a little luck. Colonel Charlie Beckwith, Delta Force commander, was confident. "We can do this," he told President Carter. The military planners had determined they needed a minimum of 6 operational helicopters at Desert 1 for the mission to proceed. Any fewer, and they wouldn't have enough lift capacity to extract both the assault force and the hostages. Carter approved the mission on April 16th. What nobody knew was that this operation was already doomed before it even began. April 24th, 1980, 7:30 p.m. local time. The sun set over the Arabian Sea as 8 massive RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters prepared to launch from the USS Nimitz. These helicopters had been stored on the carrier for months with minimal maintenance. Navy officials insisted they were in top mechanical condition. That assessment would prove tragically wrong. At approximately 1930 hours, the helicopters, call sign Bluebeard, lifted off one by one and headed toward the Iranian coast, 60 miles away. Leading them was Navy Commander James Seifert. The plan called for them to fly in formation at 200 feet, using primitive night vision goggles to navigate across 600 miles of hostile terrain. Meanwhile, Colonel James Kyle and Delta Force Commander Charlie Beckwith took off from Masira Island, Oman, aboard the lead MC-130 Combat Talon. They arrived at Desert 1 first, along with Air Force combat controllers who would guide in the helicopters. The initial landing was smooth. Kyle's team secured the landing zone without incident. Then things started to go wrong. Shortly after the landing, an Iranian civilian bus traveling on a nearby road drove straight through the secured area. Army Rangers were forced to stop it, detaining 43 passengers to maintain operational security. The element of surprise was already compromised. Minutes later, a fuel tanker truck ignored orders to stop. A Ranger fired a shoulder-mounted rocket, destroying the truck in a massive fireball. The driver escaped in a trailing vehicle. Now Iranian authorities potentially knew Americans were operating in the area. But the real nightmare was still to come. As the helicopter formation approached Desert 1, they flew directly into something the mission planners hadn't anticipated: a haboob. A haboob is a violent, wind-driven sandstorm common to desert regions. The dust is so fine, it's like flying through milk. Visibility, zero. The helicopter pilots, wearing crude night vision goggles and trying to maintain formation at 200 feet, found themselves in a waking nightmare. Marine pilots later told Beckwith and Kyle it was the worst flying experience of their lives, and some of these men were Vietnam combat veterans. Less than 2 hours into the flight, warning lights lit up the cockpit. The blade inspection method indicator, the BIM light, warned of a possible rotor blade crack. In previous incidents, this had caused catastrophic rotor failures and fatal crashes. The pilot had no choice. He landed the helicopter in the desert and abandoned it. The crew was picked up by another helicopter, but Bluebeard 6 was out of the mission. Flying through the sandstorm, the hydraulic system began failing. The aircraft could barely maintain control. The pilot fought the stick, but the helicopter was dying. He turned back toward the Nimitz. Another helicopter lost. Blinded by the sandstorm, suffering equipment malfunctions, and fighting severe air sickness from the turbulence, the remaining 6 helicopters finally limped into Desert 1. They were over 90 minutes late. Colonel Kyle and Delta Force had been sitting in the desert, watching the clock tick, wondering if the helicopters would even show up. When they finally arrived, Kyle conducted a rapid assessment. During the post-flight inspection, mechanics discovered a hydraulic leak. The aircraft couldn't maintain pressure. It was unflyable. Kyle now had 5 operational helicopters. He needed 6. The mission required 6 helicopters minimum to carry all the personnel and hostages. With only 5, there wasn't enough lift capacity. At 2:40 a.m. local time, Kyle made the hardest call of his career. He radioed the commander, "We need to abort." President Carter, monitoring the operation from the White House Situation Room, gave the order, "Abort the mission, bring our men home." The elite operators who had trained for months sat in the Iranian desert, devastated. They'd come 600 miles into enemy territory. They were 50 miles from Tehran. The hostages were so close, and now they were leaving with nothing. But the nightmare wasn't over. In fact, the worst was yet to come. With the mission aborted, Kyle now had to orchestrate an emergency evacuation. Over 130 men and all their equipment needed to get on the C-130s and leave Iranian airspace before sunrise. One of the C-130s was running critically low on fuel and needed to depart immediately. To make room for it to taxi, Kyle ordered Marine Major James Schaefer to reposition his helicopter, Bluebeard 3. The helicopter had a flattened nose wheel from the rough landing and couldn't taxi on the ground. Schaefer would have to hover taxi, lifting the aircraft just off the ground and moving it laterally. Major Schaefer started the engines. The rotor blades began spinning, immediately kicking up a blinding cloud of desert dust. In front of the helicopter, an Air Force combat controller tried to direct the maneuver with hand signals, but the rotor wash blasted him with sand and debris. Blinded, he began backing away. Inside the cockpit, Schaefer couldn't see anything except the silhouette of the controller through the dust cloud. When he saw the controller moving backward, Schaefer thought his helicopter was drifting backward. He pushed the stick forward to correct. The helicopter lurched forward, directly into the C-130 transport plane. The RH-53D's massive main rotor blades sliced into the C-130's vertical stabilizer, then crashed into the wing root, right where the fuel tanks were located. The explosion was instantaneous. Both aircraft erupted in a massive fireball. Ammunition inside the C-130 began cooking off, sending tracers screaming across the desert night. Red-hot chunks of metal rained down on the landing zone. Delta Force operators who had been boarding the C-130 came tumbling out the side doors as Air Force loadmasters fought to control the panic. The heat was so intense that the fire could be seen for miles. When the flames finally subsided, 8 Americans were dead. 5 Air Force crew members from the C-130, 3 Marines from the helicopter. 5 more were badly burned. The helicopter's pilot and co-pilot barely survived, their bodies seared by the flames. Colonel Kyle stood in the Iranian desert, watching both aircraft burn, and realized the operation had gone from failure to catastrophe. There was no time to mourn. Iranian authorities would certainly see the fire. Military forces could arrive at any moment. Kyle ordered an immediate evacuation. Everyone crammed into the remaining C-130s. In the chaos they left behind, 5 RH-53D helicopters, mostly intact classified mission documents, maps of Tehran, the bodies of the 8 dead Americans. The intelligence gift to Iran was staggering, but there was no choice. At 3:45 a.m., the last C-130 lifted off from Desert 1, leaving the burning wreckage behind. Operation Eagle Claw was over. The news hit America like a gut punch. On April 25, 1980, President Carter appeared on national television to address the nation. The mission was not successful, he said, his voice heavy with defeat. 8 American servicemen were killed. The Iranian government declared the failure a miracle from God, proof that Allah was protecting the Islamic Revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini's prestige skyrocketed. The hostages, who had been held primarily at the embassy compound, were immediately scattered across Iran to multiple locations. A second rescue attempt was now impossible. The American public was devastated. After 5 months of captivity, after watching their fellow citizens paraded on television by hostile captors, they had hoped Operation Eagle Claw would bring them home. Instead, it brought death and humiliation. U.S. Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, who had opposed the military option from the beginning, resigned in protest. He had predicted the operation would fail and endanger the hostages. He had been right. Politically, the failure was catastrophic for President Carter. His approval ratings, already low, collapsed further. On November 4, 1980, exactly 1 year after the hostages were taken, Ronald Reagan defeated Carter in a landslide election. Carter himself later acknowledged that the failure of Operation Eagle Claw was the major factor in his loss. The hostages remained captive for 444 days total. They were finally released on January 20, 1981, just minutes after Ronald Reagan took the oath of office. But Operation Eagle Claw's impact went far beyond politics. Admiral James Holloway III led the official military investigation. The findings were damning. The Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines had trained separately with minimal joint exercises. The helicopters were poorly maintained and unsuited for the desert environment. The Habub sandstorm was never factored into planning. When things went wrong, there were no backup procedures. The helicopter pilots weren't informed about local weather patterns to maintain secrecy. In short, the mission had been doomed from the start, but from this disaster came transformation. Operation Eagle Claw killed 8 men and freed 0 hostages, but it gave birth to the most effective special operations force in human history. The Holloway report led directly to the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, which fundamentally restructured how the U.S. military operates. Services were now required to work together, not as independent fiefdoms, but as a unified joint force. More immediately, Eagle Claw led to the creation of 2 revolutionary organizations: the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, established at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. JSOC would coordinate all special operations across all branches. No more Army versus Navy versus Air Force. 1 command, 1 mission. The United States Special Operations Command, USSOCOM, activated on April 16, 1987. This gave Special Operations Forces their own unified command structure, budget, and training pipeline. The lessons learned at Desert 1 were written in blood, but they were learned well. When Navy SEAL Team 6 raided Osama bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, On May 2, 2011, they flew in stealth helicopters that could never have been imagined in 1980. In Iran's desert, at the location of Desert 1, there's a mosque called the Gratitude Mosque, built to commemorate what Iranians call a miracle. Mock-ups of the helicopters sit beside wreckage from the actual aircraft. But in America, we remember Desert 1 differently. We remember it as the night when everything went wrong, when mechanical failures, bad luck, and poor planning converged into tragedy. We remember it as the night that humbled a superpower and toppled a presidency. But we also remember it as the night that forced us to rebuild, to learn, to adapt. Operation Eagle Claw was a disaster, but disasters can be teachers if we're willing to listen. The mission failed, but the warriors who flew into the darkness that night, they succeeded in something more important. They showed that America would not abandon its people, that no matter how impossible the odds, no matter how dangerous the mission, the United States would try. Lieutenant General Michael Conley, commander of Air Force Special Operations Command, said it best. We remember the events at Desert 1 not just as a moment of loss, but as an inflection point. We honor their sacrifice, and we recognize the legacy they left behind. That legacy lives on today. In every joint special operations mission, in every precisely executed raid, in every hostage rescued by teams that trained to a standard the 1980 force could never have imagined. Operation Eagle Claw taught us that courage without preparation is not enough, that bravery without coordination leads to tragedy. But it also taught us that from the ashes of failure, something stronger can rise. 8 men died in the desert that night. 53 hostages remained captive. But a new era of American special operations was born in those flames, forged by failure, tempered by loss, and dedicated to ensuring that Desert 1 would never happen again. This was Operation Eagle Claw, the mission that was almost a disaster. Actually, it was a disaster, but it was also the beginning.